Last week, I gave a presentation to the Music and Drama Expo in London. Many people in the audience asked for a version of the talk that they could show in their schools. Although I am, of course, happy to visit your school and give the presentation, not all schools have the budget for that. So, here is a version that you can show in your school or other venues for free. If you do, please credit Action Work. Hello, my name is Andy. I'm an actor and a theatre director, and I've spent over 35 years working in education. I want to start with a quick piece of context because it explains why I'm so stubborn about this topic. I've had what some people describe as an unusual upbringing. I grew up in the jungle with the indigenous Temia people of Malaysia. That gave me a vantage point on learning that sits outside of Western schooling and, honestly, outside of Western anxiety about schooling. In that community, learning wasn't something you did after you proved that you were ready. Learning was what you did because you were alive. You learned by watching, copying, trying, failing safely, being corrected, playing, being teased a little, being forgiven quickly, and being invited back in. And then I came back to the UK and re-entered school. And I struggled, not just academically, but socially too. I didn't always know the codes, when to speak, when not to, how to recover after you got something wrong, how to handle shame, how to handle boredom, and how to handle pressure. I wasn't always excluded, but I wasn't always included either. There's a difference. I left school at 16 with no qualifications. Then later, as an adult, I went back into education. I eventually earned a doctorate and became a faculty dean at an international university. That's a big turnaround. And I don't say that as a motivational story. I say it because it bothers me how quickly we treat some young people as finished. Somewhere between jungle learning and social theatre, I found something that gave me a route back into thinking and into belonging. And now I'm director of Action Work, a theatre and education company. We tour workshops and shows to schools across the UK and abroad. So this talk isn't theoretical for me. It's personal, it's practical, and it's political in a small p kind of a way. Because when a student is pushed out, something has failed upstream. Not always the student, often the system around them, sometimes us, even when we're doing our best. Today, I want to invite a difficult question. What are we rehearsing in our schools without meaning to? And what could we rehearse instead? So, today I want to talk about two things that don't usually get invited into the same meeting: exclusion and drama. And I know what some people hear when they see more drama. They think more conflict, more noise, more corridor incidents, more, can I have a word? More exhaustion. That kind of drama none of us want. I'm talking about a different kind of drama. Structured social theatre as an everyday pedagogy, a way of teaching and learning that can reduce the moments that typically lead to removal, suspension, or permanent exclusion. Not only because drama is magic, because drama, when it's structured, is rehearsal. It's rehearsal for pressure, rehearsal for disagreement, rehearsal for repair. And here is the provocative claim I'm going to stand by. In schools, we often treat the most important skills as if they're optional. The skills that keep a student in the room when they're annoyed, the skills that keep a student thinking when they're embarrassed, the skills that help a student disagree without exploding, and the skills that let someone come back in after a wobble instead of doubling down. These are not soft skills. These are stay in the room skills. And if we don't teach them, we end up punishing students for not having them. So, my promise today is simple. I'm not here to romanticize behaviour. I'm not here to say exclusions never happen. I'm not here to pretend that teachers aren't under pressure. I'm here to say if we can teach social and thinking skills inside ordinary lessons, we can reduce the number of students who end up at the end of the sanction chain. And I want to do it in a way that doesn't ask teachers to become therapists, doesn't ask schools to absorb endless emotional labour, and doesn't ask you to be more patient as the main strategy. Instead, structure, role, debrief. Now, a quick check-in before we move on. When I say exclusion, I'm not only talking about the official decision. I'm also talking about the daily micro exclusions, being constantly sent out, being isolated, being removed from learning again and again, being treated like a threat rather than a learner. Formal exclusions are the headline, but the culture sits underneath. So, my roadmap is this: what the numbers tell us, who carries the risk, and why it matters. And then a practical pivot, how structured social theatre can be used inside ordinary lessons without chaos. And finally, what you can try next week and how we can support you if you want it. Let's define terms clearly, because people often use excluded to mean anything from sent out for 5 minutes to moved on permanently. A suspension is temporary. A student is suspended for a set period of time and then returns to school. A permanent exclusion is when a student is excluded and will not return to that school, unless, of course, the exclusion is overturned. I want to say something uncomfortable that sits between these definitions. A suspension is supposed to be temporary, but if it happens again and again, it becomes a pattern, and patterns become identity. You know this. A student becomes that student. A family becomes that family. A class becomes that class. And what that does to learning is brutal, because learning needs safety, not comfort, safety. A student needs to believe in their bones that there is a route back in after a mistake. When that belief goes, everything gets harder. The statistics I'm going to use are for state-funded schools in England, and they're based on school census data. My source is the Department for Education, suspensions and permanent exclusions in England. I'm not using them as a weapon, I'm using them as a mirror, because the numbers tell us something about system strain, and they tell us whether our current strategies are working at scale. Now, for the uncomfortable bit. In 2013-14, there were 4,950 permanent exclusions in England, described as 6 per 10,000 student enrolments. In 2023-24, there were 10,900 permanent exclusions, or 13 per 10,000 student enrolments. So, in plain terms, permanent exclusion in England's state-funded sector have more than doubled over the last decade. And I want to slow down here because when people hear a percentage like 0.13, they sometimes shrug. 0.13% sounds small. Yes, it's not most students, but it's still 10,900 lives in a single year where the relationship with school hits a major rupture. And that rupture doesn't just happen to the student. It happens to the family. It happens to staff. It happens to peers. It changes the story of what school is. Now, alongside exclusions, suspensions are huge in volume. In 2023-24, there were 955,000 suspensions. That's almost a million, equivalent to 1,131 per 10,000 student enrollments. That's the number I want you to feel. Because suspensions are where many exclusions begin, culturally, even if they never become permanent. Suspensions tell us how many students are repeatedly losing learning time and repeatedly losing connection. And here's a question that's both practical and provocative. If almost a million suspensions are happening in a year, what does that say about what we're asking classrooms to hold? And what does that say about whether our current tools are enough? I'm going to do something slightly cheeky here, a projection. It's not a prophecy, it's a thought experiment. It's just a way of asking, if the direction stays the same, how big does this become? So, if we take the last decade's increase and extend it to 2050 in a straight line, we land somewhere in the mid-20s of thousands of permanent exclusions in a year. If we assume it compounds at a similar rate, we land in a completely different world, tens of thousands more, around the 80 plus thousand mark. Again, I'm not offering forecasts. I'm underlining something simple. If the direction continues, this stops being a niche issue. It becomes mainstream pressure, shaping school culture, workload, and life chances. And for teachers and leaders, it becomes an ethical question because you can't run a humane system by steadily expanding the number of young people we remove from it. So the question becomes, where do we intervene? And my argument today is intervene upstream inside ordinary teaching before flash points become rupture. Now, the ethical core. Secondary schools account for the majority of permanent exclusions, 85% to be exact. Students with special educational needs are at the sharp end, with 41 students out of every 10,000 permanently excluded. This is compared to 8 for those with no identified special educational needs. That's roughly a 5 times difference for SEN students. So, if we're serious about reducing exclusion, we can't only talk about sanctions. We have to talk about who is carrying the risk. We have to talk about vulnerability and unmet need. We have to talk about which students are being asked to fit into systems that were never designed with them in mind. This is not a blame teachers argument. Teachers are often the only stable adult in a young person's day. Teachers are holding far more than anyone should reasonably hold. But the data does force questions. Are we building inclusive systems, or are we building sorting machines? And if our systems are sorting, what are we rehearsing? What does exclusion actually do? Socially, it can fracture belonging, friendships, and trusted adult support. And belonging isn't a fluffy word here. Belonging is behaviour management in its deepest form. A student who feels they belong will tolerate frustration longer. They'll accept correction more easily. They'll risk getting things wrong. They'll attempt work. They'll repair after conflict. A student who feels that they don't belong will protect themselves. Sometimes that protection looks like withdrawal. Sometimes it looks like defiance, and sometimes it looks like violence. Sometimes it looks like I don't care. Academically, exclusion disrupts learning time and often destabilizes routines and placements. And once routines are broken, new routines are hard to build. Longer term, exclusion concentrates disadvantage. The costs, they don't disappear, they move. They move into alternative provision. They move into family strain. They move into health and mental health services. And they move into community safety. So, yes, sometimes exclusion happens, but rising exclusion at scale is not a sign of a healthy system. It's a sign that we're failing to teach and contain key moments earlier. And if that's true, then the next questions are simple. What are the moments? What are the flashpoints? And what are we currently doing in those moments? Here's the pivot. What if we could reduce exclusions by reducing the number of flashpoints that reach that point of removal? Not by going soft, not by removing boundaries, not by turning classrooms into therapy circles, but by teaching three things inside ordinary lessons using structure. How to stay curious under pressure. How to communicate without escalating. How to think instead of react. Because here's a hard truth. A lot of behaviour is not a moral failure. It's a skill failure. It's the collapse of language, the collapse of social scripts, the collapse of self-management, and sometimes the collapse of trust. If we only respond with punishment, we might get short-term compliance, but we don't build capacity. And if we don't build capacity, the same students keep arriving at the same cliff edge. So, social theatre, as I'm using the term today, is a capacity building approach. It gives students rehearsal space for those moments that usually blow up. And it gives teachers structure so they're not improvising crisis management all day. Social theatre is not, let's do a play. It's a structured learning frame where students explore curriculum content and real dilemmas through roles, choices, and consequences. And then crucially, we harvest it into learning. This harvest is what makes it pedagogy and not just a nice activity. The key move in social theatre is role distance. If a student says, I'm arguing as the engineer, it's safer than I think, because the class can challenge the engineer's position without the student feeling that their identity is under attack. That reduces shame, that reduces defensiveness, that reduces the need to save face. And anyone who's worked with teenagers knows this. Save face behaviour is rocket fuel for conflict. Role distance gives us a way to keep challenging without humiliation. And the paradox is that this distancing brings us closer. Right, I want to demystify the teacher role here. The teacher doesn't need to be an actor. You're not performing. You are directing structure. You set the roles. You set the rules. You set the time limit. You set the question, and then you return it back to the curriculum. So when social theatre fails, it usually fails in one predictable way. It turns a structured learning frame into free role play. The fix is always the same. Tighten the structure and you tighten the learning outcome. And here's a line that I'll give you because it's a useful provocation in staff rooms. If a drama activity creates chaos, it wasn't too creative, it was under-structured. Creativity without structure isn't freedom, it's insecurity. Students feel it and they test it. Structure is kindness. There are, of course, no guarantees that theatre-based learning will automatically re-engage every student. That caveat applies to every pedagogy you've ever used. What the evidence does support is a more careful claim. When arts approaches are structured, guided by adults, and explicitly linked to learning, they can support engagement. But as the research suggests, you need to intentionally connect it to the curriculum, to teaching and learning. Because it's easy to run a lively session and call it success. But if you can't harvest it into writing, reasoning, vocabulary, and curriculum outcomes, you've just done a great warm-up. Now, I'm not saying theatre prevents exclusion in a simple cause and effect way. That would be too neat and, frankly, too convenient. The honest claim is this. Social theatre is a credible re-engagement approach when it is used to train the underlying social cognitive skills that keep students in learning, especially those whose needs show up as behaviour. And this is the key line for today. Use evidence carefully, not as miracles, as structure. Now, the practical classroom question. How can non-drama teachers use social theatre to teach academic subjects as an everyday pedagogy without turning the room upside down? Here's the principle. You don't only use social theatre because it's fun. You use it because it makes thinking visible. And visible thinking is accessible thinking. There are lots of techniques, but I'll give you 3 formats that work across subjects. I'll explain all 3, then I'll share the control system that keeps them safe and focused. We'll start with the town hall. You give a curriculum-linked problem and a decision. Students take stakeholder roles and must use evidence from the lesson. For example, in a geography lesson on flood management, roles could include local resident, business owner, climate scientist, council leader, youth representative, engineer, and a farmer. The problem might be, do we build the flood barrier? Yes or no? And who pays? Your job as teacher is not to be impressed by confidence. Your job is to keep pulling it back to evidence. Where is that in the text? What data supports that? Quote the source. Name the process. So, the drama isn't performance. The drama is structured argument. This works brilliantly in geography, science, history, citizenship, English language, business, and many other subjects. The second is expert witness. One group becomes the experts. They're trained from a text, diagram, or source material that you've provided. Another group questions them. You insist that answers are grounded in evidence. So, in science, for example, the experts. We are the researchers explaining the evidence for a theory. The questioners. We are the review panel. We want methods and limitations. Or in history, experts. We are historians defending this interpretation. Questioners. We are opposing counsel. Show us the sources. Or in English, experts. We are the author's defenders. Show us language choices. The questioners. We are critics. Prove intent, effect, context. Again, the drama is not costumes, it's pressure on reasoning. The third one is the dilemma line or the yes no line. Most of you will know this from school, so I won't labour it. I want to frame it as social theatre because it's a simple way of rehearsing judgment, disagreement, and movement without debate becoming a fight. In a classroom, the setup is simple. One end of the room is yes, the other end is no, and the middle can be depends, but only if you can name what it depends on. Then you give a statement linked to the curriculum or the theme that you're working on. For example, in a staff context, you might use a different class or year group is a polite way of saying the system isn't working. Or in history, was this policy justified? Yes or no? In science, is the evidence strong enough to act now? Yes or no? In geography, does this development do more good than harm? Yes or no? The key is what happens next. You give students a tight speaking structure so it stays safe and academic. One sentence. I chose this side because. One sentence. My evidence is. And one sentence. A reasonable person might argue the other side because. That last sentence matters. It teaches disagreement without disrespect. It teaches perspective without surrender. Then you harvest it into academic output. For example, if the system isn't working, the first thing I would adjust is X because X. So the dilemma line becomes more than opinion, it becomes reasoning under constraint. Two quick guardrails apply to all of this. First, this isn't denying serious behaviour. It's about where we place the explanation and where we place the leverage. Second, we stay away from personal stories about identifiable students or schools. We stay at the level of ideas and conditions. Now, the key point is what happens after the drama moment. We feel it. The thinking is alive. The room moves. People shift lens. But it only counts as learning when you turn it into something you can name, capture, and build upon. That's the harvest. And the harvest is where a lot of teachers accidentally weaken it because they skip it due to time or they let the activity be the whole lesson. So, here are simple harvest options that don't add marking burden. A 6-sentence paragraph using keywords that you give them. A short exam-style answer using evidence, not just opinion. A brief evaluation where they weigh up two sides and reach a judgment, or an exit ticket, my claim, my evidence, my counter argument. Social theatre is not replacing academic rigour, it's a route into it. Now, the most common reaction from non-drama teachers at this point is still, yes, but that will be chaos. And that's a fair fear, because if you've ever seen this done badly, it can be chaos. It turns into free for all debate. The confident dominate, the anxious disappear, and the teacher spends the next 10 minutes firefighting. So, here's the reassurance. Social theatre becomes safe and controlled when you treat structure as the main skill. I use 5 simple controls. They're not fancy, but they're non-negotiable. If you use these, you can run this in a normal classroom without it tipping into drama as disruption. 1. The rules. Say them out loud. No humiliation. Critique ideas, not people. One voice at a time, and a clear stop signal. 2. Roles. Not everyone has to be a speaker. Give legitimate roles that still matter. Chair, timekeeper, evidence checker, scribe, summariser, and so on. That's inclusion by design. 3. Time limits. Short rounds, strict countdown, end while it's still working. Most activities fail because they run on too long. 4. Sentence stems. Students who escalate often don't have scripts for disagreement, so you give them scripts. My evidence is. I disagree because a consequence could be. Another option is. And 5. The harvest. Always end with a product. Notes, a paragraph, a model answer, an exit ticket. That's what stops it being a nice activity and makes it pedagogy. And once those 5 controls are in place, the room changes. You're not hoping for good behaviour. You're engineering safe structure for thinking under pressure. Here are my closing thoughts. More drama does not mean more noise. It means more structured rehearsal for belonging, for communication, for critical thinking, and repair after a wobble. Exclusions happen when regulation collapses, words fail, and there's no route back into learning. Social theatre gives us a way to teach those moments upstream, inside ordinary lessons, especially for students whose needs show up as behaviour. More drama, less exclusions, not only because drama is magic, but because drama gives us structure, a way to rehearse what we expect instead of only punishing what we dislike. If you remember one line, make it this: we don't just manage behaviour, we teach the skills that make learning possible under pressure. Now, a final provocation before we finish, and it's aimed at all of us, including me. If a student keeps exploding, we can keep asking, what's wrong with them? Or we can ask, what's missing in the system? Because a lot of young people are not failing school. School is failing to hold them. Not because teachers don't care, because the demands are rising and the tools and resources aren't keeping up. So here's the practical invitation. Pick one small structure from today: the town hall, expert witness, or dilemma line. Just one. Run it for 6 minutes. Add sentence stems, use a stop signal, and harvest into a short written product. That's it. And if you want support doing this safely, that's what action work does. We can run staff training that is grounded, practical, and honest. We can model strategies in lessons. We can co-plan with departments. We can work with groups who are most at risk of losing learning time. We can help you build a shared approach so it doesn't live in one heroic teacher's classroom and disappear when they leave. We can run creative, interactive workshops dealing with bullying, empowerment, and a whole lot more. If you want to talk about that, please email me or actionwork@gmail.com. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel so it helps us bring more free resources to you like this. Thank you very much and goodbye.